I didn't think love ended with a fight. I used to think it ended with an argument that finally got too loud, a door that finally got slammed, words that finally couldn't be taken back. But what I learned is that sometimes it ends in the softest way. A quiet moment that doesn't look like a moment until it's already done. That night started like any other work event I didn't want to attend. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, tying the same conservative tie I wore to every corporate function, listening to the low hum of the heater kicking on and off. My wife, Hannah, was behind me, fastening an earring with careful fingers. "We should go," she said, like it was practical advice. "People notice who shows up together." I nodded because that's what I usually did. I was good at keeping things steady. I was good at showing up. I was good at being reliable in a way that didn't require attention. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I was 49 then, and I'd lived in Minneapolis long enough to stop complaining about winter, unless it was the kind that made driving dangerous. I worked as an operations lead at a mid-sized consulting firm, nothing glamorous. But the place ran on process and quiet discipline, and I fit into it the way a well-labeled binder fits into a shelf. I believed my marriage ran the same way. Hannah and I had been married for 21 years. There were no public scandals, no dramatic low points. Just a slow drift I couldn't put a clean name on. Conversations that shortened. Dinners eaten next to each other instead of with each other. Weeks where we spoke mainly in logistics. The kind of shift you tell yourself is normal because the alternative is admitting you're not being seen. The company party was downtown in a hotel ballroom that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and warmed bread. The lighting was soft and flattering, the kind designed to make everyone look less tired than they were. A jazz trio played near the corner, loud enough to fill the silence but not loud enough to cover the truth if it decided to show itself. HR called it culture. Leadership called it connection. Most of us called it what it was, which was a requirement wrapped in free drinks. Hannah walked in with her shoulders back and her smile ready. Within minutes, she drifted into a circle near the center of the room. People leaned toward her when she spoke. She looked relaxed. She looked confident. She looked like someone who had been waiting to be noticed. I stood slightly outside the crowd and watched, holding a drink I barely tasted. A few minutes later, Derek came over. Derek Reynolds had been my closest friend at the firm for years. We'd survived reorganizations, rough quarters, impossible clients. We had shared the kind of inside jokes that don't make sense to anyone else, and I had trusted him in the way you trust someone who has seen you tired, stressed, and still treated you like you were worth something. He clapped my shoulder and handed me a glass. "Look at us," he said, grinning. "All dressed up for the annual performance review with appetizers." I smiled because that was the script. I said something back. I don't even remember what. It was normal. Too normal. At some point, the room started to feel tight, not emotionally, physically. Too many conversations, too much perfume and cologne layered together, too much laughter that didn't land. I felt myself needing a corner where nothing was expected from me for a minute. So I stepped away and moved toward the bar. The bar was set along the side of the room, partially hidden by tall decorative plants and a row of backlit bottles that made the glass glow. The bartender was wiping down the counter with slow, methodical movements. I remember the sound of the cloth, the clink of ice in someone else's drink, the steady pulse of the bass through the floor. I stepped closer, and I saw them. Not in the open, not careless. Tucked into a narrow blind spot behind the bar where the lighting was dimmer, where the plants blocked the sightline unless you were standing exactly where I was standing. Hannah and Derek. His hand was on her waist like it belonged there. Her fingers were curled into the collar of his jacket. The kiss wasn't rushed, it wasn't hesitant. It looked practiced, like a habit they didn't need to think about. My body didn't surge with anger, it did something else. It went still. For a second, everything inside me tightened, like a muscle that refused to move. My heart didn't race, it felt like it paused. My fingers went numb against the edge of the bar, and I had this brief, strange thought that I might faint standing up, not from emotion, but from the way my body couldn't decide what to do with what it was seeing. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds, maybe. Longer. The party kept going around me like I was inside a glass box. Someone laughed loudly behind me. A server walked past carrying a tray of tiny desserts. The jazz kept playing, steady and indifferent. I stepped backward slowly, careful, as if sudden movement would crack whatever was holding me together. And that's when I noticed Sophie. She was standing near the edge of the dance floor, slightly apart from everyone else. Her posture was straight. Her expression was calm in a way that didn't match the room. Her eyes weren't scanning for a friend or a table. They were fixed on the same narrow space behind the bar. She had seen it too. Sophie was Derek's wife. We weren't close, but we knew each other well enough. Dinners together, weekend barbecues, the kind of relationship built by proximity and routine. Our eyes met. I expected shock, tears, a reaction that would make the room turn and look. Instead, she looked at me with something that unsettled me more than surprise: recognition. Then she walked toward me, her steps steady, like she wasn't worried about falling apart in public. She stopped beside me close enough that I could smell her perfume, clean and familiar, and she didn't look toward Derek or Hannah even once. "Don't react," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't cold, it wasn't angry, it was controlled, like someone speaking through a plan. I swallowed. My throat felt raw. "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat. "For a few weeks," she replied. "Long enough to understand this isn't only about what you just saw." I turned slightly toward her, trying to process the calm in her face. "What do you mean?" I asked. She finally looked at me, really looked, like she was checking whether I could hold my own weight. "If you confront them right now," she said, "they'll lie. They'll make it sound accidental. They'll call it a misunderstanding, and you'll spend months trying to prove what you already know." My hands were still resting on the bar, but I couldn't feel the counter anymore. "Then what are we supposed to do?" I asked. Sophie's eyes stayed steady. "We wait," she said. "Wait for what?" "For them to show their hand," she replied, "so no one can pretend this was harmless." I stared at her, trying to connect the pieces: the kiss, the timing, her certainty. She lowered her voice even more. "This isn't just about the affair," she said. "It's about what they've been doing around it." "What have they been doing?" I asked, and even as I said it, I felt a shift inside me, like something moving from disbelief into focus. Sophie didn't answer right away. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, then paused as if she was choosing her words carefully. "There are trails," she said. "Not the kind that end in the bedroom." My mouth went dry. "What kind then?" "The kind that end on paper," she said. I stood there with the noise of the party pressing in from all sides, and for the first time since I'd seen them, I felt something clearer than shock, not rage, not grief. A cold, steady understanding. This wasn't a mistake. It was planning. Sophie touched my arm lightly, not as comfort, more like an anchor to keep me from doing something impulsive. "Stay calm, Ethan," she said. "We need them to finish what they started." I watched across the room as Hannah laughed at something someone said, relaxed and bright, like nothing was wrong. Derek moved through the crowd like he owned the evening, shaking hands, smiling, doing the kind of social work that made leadership remember your name. And I understood, quietly, that if I made a scene, I would give them space to rewrite the story. So I didn't. I just stood there, breathing slowly, holding still, and letting the moment settle. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. A new message popped up from Hannah. "Got pulled into a conversation with finance and legal. Don't wait up." I looked at the words for a long time, then put the phone face down on the bar. And I didn't move. Not yet. I left the ballroom without saying goodbye. I didn't look for Hannah. I didn't look for Derek. I walked past the valet stand and into the cold like I was leaving any other work function early. The air outside had that sharp, metallic bite it gets in Minneapolis when the snow has been sitting too long. The sidewalk was damp, salted, and uneven. Cars slid past with their headlights smeared by light snowfall. I sat in my car for a full minute before turning the key. Not because I couldn't drive, but because my hands needed time to feel like mine again. The steering wheel was cold through my gloves. My phone sat on the passenger seat, screen dark, like it didn't know it had just become evidence. When I got home, the house was quiet in a way that felt staged. The porch light came on, the entryway smelled faintly of pine from the half-decorated tree in the living room, and everything looked exactly as it always looked. That was the strange part. The outside world had shifted, but the lamps were still in the same place. The hallway runner was still slightly crooked. The furnace still hummed. I set my keys down carefully and stood there listening. No TV, no dishwasher, just the low mechanical sound of heat moving through vents. I poured a glass of water and drank it too quickly. The glass tapped the counter when I set it down, a dull, ordinary sound that felt too loud. I stared at the Christmas tree lights and tried to make my mind do something simple, like name objects, sofa, coffee table, garland box. Each thing was normal. My chest wasn't. I didn't sit down right away. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. A neighbor's porch was lit. Someone's dog barked once. Nothing about the world looked different, which meant the difference was in me. Hannah came home close to midnight. I heard her before I saw her. The front door opened. Keys landed in the bowl, a soft sigh like she'd practiced it in the car. "You left early," she said, stepping into the living room. Her coat was still on. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. Her voice was neutral, almost casual, as if she was commenting on the weather. "I wasn't feeling great," I said. It was true, just not in the way she would assume. She nodded without pressing. "Long night." She leaned in and kissed my cheek. Quick, familiar, efficient. Then she went upstairs and turned on the shower. I stayed on the couch staring at the tree, counting the seconds between the rush of water and my own breathing. For a moment I tried to listen for guilt in the sound upstairs, but water is water. It doesn't tell you anything. When she came to bed, she fell asleep quickly, her back turned toward me. I lay there in the dark, looking at the ceiling, and my mind started doing something it hadn't done in a long time. It started organizing, not feelings, data. The past few months appeared in my head like a list I'd avoided reading, late meetings that ran past dinner, small changes in her routines she waved off as busy season, her phone face down more often, passwords changed because of security, a new habit of taking calls in the garage because the reception is better. I'd accepted all of it because that was easier than asking questions that could break something. By morning, I'd decided on one thing. I wasn't going to ask her anything yet. I woke before my alarm and made coffee the way I always did, standing at the counter with the mug warming my hands. The news played softly in the background. Markets, weather, sports, ordinary noise. Hannah came down dressed for work, hair still slightly damp, moving with the calm rhythm of someone who slept well. "You okay?" she asked, opening the refrigerator. "Just tired," I said. She nodded and started talking about a client conversation from the night before, about how leadership was finally paying attention, about how this next quarter was going to matter. I listened the way I always did, and I realized something unpleasant. She was comfortable, not nervous, not guarded. Comfortable, like she thought whatever happened in that blind spot behind the bar had stayed there. After she left, I washed my mug, wiped down the counter, and did something I hadn't done in years. I opened our financial dashboard. We had a joint checking account, a joint savings account, and separate credit cards. We also had a retirement account we rarely touched, the kind you don't think about because you assume it's safe by default. We both had access. We both trusted that access. I didn't go looking for a disaster. I didn't expect a giant withdrawal or a dramatic transfer. If something like that had happened, it would have forced me to pay attention earlier. What I saw was worse in a quieter way. Small transfers, repeating amounts, regular timing, labels vague enough to blend into normal household movement. Consulting, travel advance, reimbursement. Words that could mean anything if you didn't want to look closely. I clicked into the transaction details and felt my jaw tighten. The transfers weren't random. They were spaced, controlled, almost like someone was testing how much they could move without triggering questions. Not stealing with panic, moving money with planning. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen until the coffee taste in my mouth turned bitter. Then I did what I always did when something felt wrong at work. I documented, I took screenshots, I downloaded statements. I saved them to a folder that wasn't named anything interesting. I didn't tell myself a story about what it meant. I didn't allow myself that comfort. I just collected. At the office that day, the building buzzed with post-party energy. People talked about the food, the speeches, who stayed late, who got FaceTime with leadership. A few people mentioned Hannah. She really knows how to work a room. Derek's looking strong going into next week. Derek stopped by my desk mid-morning. Same smile, same ease. His suit jacket looked like it had never been wrinkled in its life. "Good turnout last night," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Felt like momentum." "Sure did," I replied. He talked about the upcoming pitch meeting, a new initiative leadership was excited about, something that could change the way we deliver value. He used phrases like he'd practiced them out loud. As he spoke, I noticed something small. He didn't ask why I left early. If I had left a party abruptly in the past, Derek would have checked in. He would have made a joke, asked if I was okay, maybe even teased me for being boring. This time he didn't. It was like he didn't want to draw attention to the timeline. Before he walked away, he said, "I might send you a deck later, just want your eyes on it." "Send it," I said. At noon, I left the building and walked outside even though it was cold enough to sting. I needed air that didn't smell like carpet and coffee and ambition. I found a bench near a small plaza where the snow had been shoveled into gray piles. My breath came out in thin fog. My phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. The message was short. "We should talk. Not about feelings. About facts." I stared at it for a long time. I already knew who it was. Sophie. My thumb hovered over the screen. There was a part of me that wanted to ignore it. To go back upstairs, sit at my desk, and pretend my life was still stable if I worked hard enough. That instinct had kept my world orderly for years, but it wasn't helping anymore. I typed back. "When?" Her reply came almost immediately. "Tomorrow morning. 7:30 a.m., Oak Street Cafe, back booth." I read it twice, then locked my phone and set it face down on the bench beside me. And then I waited. I opened Derek's email and downloaded the attachment like it was any other work request. The file name was clean, generic. The kind of name people use when they want something to look official and uncomplicated. I saved it to my desktop first, then to the private folder I'd created, then to an external drive I kept at home for tax documents and backups. Not because I was panicking, because I didn't want the only copy of anything living inside a system other people could access. I closed my email. I didn't reply. I let it sit. That alone felt like a small act of discipline. Derek liked quick responses. He liked people to confirm receipt so he could keep moving. Silence in that situation created just enough discomfort to make him reveal his habits. I opened the deck. The first slide came up and I felt my jaw set. Same structure I had built months earlier, same framing language, same flow. Even the timing cues in the speaker notes were familiar, like someone had copied the bones and then tried to put new skin over it. I didn't scroll fast. I went page by page. I took screenshots, then exported the file as a PDF, then saved the original. I pulled up my own draft and placed them side by side on two screens. I marked every match, not because I needed to convince myself, but because later someone else would need to see the pattern without emotion attached. It wasn't inspiration, it was replication. The worst part was that it wasn't sloppy. They had removed a few of my internal comments. They had swapped a couple of examples. They had rewritten a sentence here and there to look different on the surface, but the logic was mine. The sequencing was mine. The structure was mine. And then I checked the metadata, creation dates, modification history, author tags. The quiet fingerprints most people forget exist. The first version of Derek's file had been created long after mine, but it didn't matter. You could still see where the content came from if you knew what to look for. I saved the metadata report. Then I did what I always did at work when a process failed. I pulled the logs. I had access to certain IT audit tools because of my role. Not full admin power, but enough to run a standard compliance review. I requested it the way I always requested it, through the normal channel, using the normal language, so no one would feel a sudden spotlight. Routine access verification. Quarterly audit. Nothing unusual. The report came back later that afternoon. I opened it alone in my office with the door shut and read it slowly. Hannah's credentials had accessed my archived project folder twice, both times outside business hours, both times late enough that it suggested privacy, not urgency. The IP addresses were internal, but the timestamps were the story. The access aligned with days Derek had asked for updated drafts. I wrote the times down. I saved the report. Then I saved a copy somewhere else. That night at home, Hannah cooked dinner. Not because she often cooked. She didn't. Not lately. But that week she did it twice. She laughed more. She touched my shoulder when she passed behind my chair. She asked about my day with a softness that felt slightly misplaced, like a tone pulled from an older version of us. It might have been guilt. It might have been instinct. Either way, it told me she felt safe enough to perform normal. After dinner, she sat on the couch and mentioned a weekend trip. Maybe a short drive north, just to reset after the pitch. I nodded. I didn't commit. I didn't argue. Later, when she fell asleep, I went back to the finances. I didn't open everything at once. I moved carefully, like I was following a procedure. Step 1. Joint checking and savings, document patterns, lock changes for later. Step 2. Credit cards, look for new merchants, recurring charges, anything tied to an entity I didn't recognize. Step 3. Retirement account, the one we treated like a sealed room. I opened the retirement portal and waited for the page to load. Nothing dramatic. No emptied account. No panic move. Just more patterns. Small reallocations. Short-term withdrawals masked as internal adjustments. Timing that matched travel reimbursements and conference weeks. Not reckless, controlled. I sat there a long time, hands resting on the desk, feeling something settle. They weren't just betraying me. They were using the stability of my life as a funding source. The next day at work, Derek stopped by again. Same calm, same easy tone. "Did you get the deck?" he asked. "I did," I said. "Any thoughts?" "I'm reviewing it," I replied. He smiled like that was enough. "Perfect. Leadership's going to love this." When he walked away, I didn't watch him with anger. I watched him like I watched a vendor who thought they could slip a cost past procurement, confident because they assumed no one would check. Sophie and I kept our communication short. No long texts, no venting, just what mattered. On Wednesday, she called me instead of texting. Her voice was quieter than usual. "I'm tired," she said. Not dramatic, not seeking comfort, just stating a fact. "I know," I replied. There was a pause. "I keep thinking about who he used to be," she said, "and how easily I tried to protect that image." I didn't interrupt. I understood the impulse. I had been doing the same thing with Hannah, just in a different shape. "We're almost there," I said. "I know," she replied. "That's what scares me." By Friday, the building had the feeling it gets before a big presentation. People were unusually polite. Calendars tightened. Meeting rooms were reserved. The executive assistant emailed reminders with cheerful exclamation points. Derek and Hannah moved through the office like a pair that had rehearsed their pacing. Close enough to signal unity, far enough to look professional. When they thought no one was looking, I saw small glances, the kind that carry private confidence. I didn't flinch. I did what I had been doing all week. I looked normal. At lunch, I walked to my car and sat for 10 minutes with the heat running. I opened my notes app and reviewed what I had, like a checklist. Original drafts saved in 3 locations, deck comparisons marked, metadata reports saved, access logs documented, financial statements downloaded, timelines matched. I wasn't building a story. I was building a record. At 12:41 p.m., I received a message from Sophie. "Everything's in place. Legal has the file." We let them speak. I read it twice, then I deleted it. Not because I didn't trust Sophie, but because I didn't want anything sitting on my phone that could be misread later. Clean process, clean trail. At 2:20, I walked to the conference room. The hallway was brighter than usual, lights reflecting off polished floors, people moving with the careful speed of a day that mattered. I paused outside the glass wall for a moment and looked in. Leadership at the table, legal present, compliance seated near the end, a laptop connected to the projector, water glasses lined up neatly like props. Derek stood near the screen adjusting his notes. Hannah sat beside him, tablet in hand, posture perfect. I stepped inside and took a seat in the second row. Then I folded my hands and waited. The presentation began like most meetings do. Quiet, controlled, a few laptops opening, pens clicking, someone clearing their throat as if that counted as preparation. Outside the glass wall, the afternoon looked flat and gray. Snow had been pushed into piles along the curb. The city kept moving like it had no opinion about what was about to happen in that room. Derek started first. He thanked leadership for the time. He made a small joke about long agendas. A few people smiled politely. Then the first slide came up, and he settled into his voice like a man stepping onto familiar ground. "This initiative positions us for long-term growth," he said. Hannah took over smoothly. She spoke with the kind of calm confidence that used to reassure me at home. She pointed to timelines, deliverables, a phased rollout. Her hands moved in practiced gestures. Nothing rushed, nothing uncertain. I watched her face, not searching for guilt, but watching for control. She looked comfortable. 5 minutes in, the door opened. Not loudly, just enough to create a shift. 2 people stepped inside, one from legal and one from compliance. They didn't announce themselves. They simply took seats near the end of the table. Chairs straightened, a few heads turned, then turned back. The atmosphere tightened without anyone naming it. Derek kept talking, but his pacing changed slightly, a fraction faster, a fraction more eager, like he wanted to get through the deck before anyone could interrupt. Hannah clicked to the next slide. Then the CEO raised a hand. "Let's pause," she said evenly. The clicker stopped in Hannah's hand. Derek smiled as if it was a normal question coming. "Sure." The CEO folded her hands on the table. "Legal received documentation this morning raising concerns about the origin of this material." The room went still in a clean, corporate way. Not dramatic, just quiet enough that every word landed. Derek's smile held, but his eyes moved once, quickly, toward Hannah. "I'm sure this is a misunderstanding." The legal counsel leaned forward slightly. "The documentation includes original drafts, file metadata, access logs, and bank records." Hannah's face lost color, not all at once, but enough that I noticed. Her mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. The CEO looked at Derek. "Before you continue, we need an explanation." Derek adjusted his posture. "Of course." Legal continued, voice calm. "Large portions of this deck match internal files authored by Mr. Caldwell, word for word, including creation timestamps predating your involvement." Every head turned toward me. I stood, slow and steady, not because I wanted the moment, but because standing made my voice cleaner. "Yes," I said. "Those drafts are mine. I have originals with creation dates and version history." Hannah made a small sound, like air catching in her throat. Derek shook his head lightly, as if disappointment was the right response. "This was collaborative," Derek said. "Ethan shared the files. We built on them as a team." Legal nodded. "We considered that. That's why we reviewed the access logs." She turned her attention to Hannah. "Your credentials accessed Mr. Caldwell's archived project folder twice outside normal business hours." Hannah blinked rapidly. "I was asked to review something," she said, voice thin. "I didn't plan to. I didn't take anything." Compliance spoke next, measured and direct. "We also identified transfers linked to a newly formed LLC, funded through accounts connected to both presenters. The transfers are structured and timed to avoid casual detection." Derek's composure cracked, not fully, but enough. "That's out of context," he said quickly. "Those were temporary movements, reimbursements. We were going to clarify ownership." The CEO's voice stayed even. "Clarify ownership before presenting it as yours?" Derek didn't answer. Hannah's eyes filled. She looked down at the table, then up again, like she was searching for a sentence that would undo what was already recorded. "I felt trapped," she said softly, and it sounded like a late addition to a story that had been written without it. He told me it was temporary, that we'd fix it after the pitch. No one interrupted her. No one comforted her. The room held silence the way it holds a final number in a report. The CEO turned to legal. Next steps. Legal nodded and looked at both of them. The presentation is suspended. Effective immediately, you are both placed on administrative leave pending investigation. HR will escort you. 2 security staff appeared at the door. Not aggressive, just present, enough to make the boundary real. Derek gathered his laptop with hands that were suddenly less smooth. He avoided looking at anyone until his eyes found mine. For a second, the confidence was gone. What was left was calculation, trying to decide what could still be salvaged. I didn't give him anything. Hannah stood slowly, clutching her tablet as if it could protect her. She glanced at me once. Her expression wasn't anger. It wasn't even surprise. It was the look of someone realizing the story they planned to control had been taken away from them. HR spoke quietly and motioned toward the door. They walked out without another word. And the room stayed silent long enough for me to hear the projector fan running, steady and indifferent, like nothing important had happened at all. The room stayed quiet after they were escorted out. Not shocked quiet, more like the kind of quiet that happens when a company switches from presentation mode into risk mode. People didn't rush to speak. They looked down at notebooks, at laptops, at water glasses, as if eye contact might drag them into the story. The CEO cleared her throat once. "This meeting is adjourned," she said. "Legal and compliance will follow up with next steps." Chairs moved. People stood. Conversations started in half sentences and stopped again. No one asked me for details, not right then. Everyone understood there were processes for this, and those processes were already moving. I walked out into the hallway and felt the air change. The carpeted corridor looked the same as it always did, but it didn't feel like it belonged to my life anymore. It felt like a place where something had been documented and filed. Sophie stepped out a moment later. She didn't come up beside me like a friend. She matched my pace at a respectful distance. "They're going to suspend him today," she said quietly. "HR already started the paperwork." "And Hannah?" I asked. "Administrative leave," she replied. "Legal will sort the rest." I nodded once. My mouth was dry, but my hands were steady. That told me something. We walked to the elevator bank and stopped. Sophie looked tired in a plain way, like someone who had been carrying a weight without telling anyone. Her eyes weren't wild. They were simply done. "They had to say it out loud," she said. "Yes," I replied. "They did." Sophie exhaled slowly, then looked away toward the windows at the end of the hallway. Snow was falling lightly, the kind that doesn't commit to a storm, but stays around all day anyway. Inside the office, the company moved fast. Calendars changed, meetings were canceled. A brief internal notice went out before the end of the day. 2 employees have been placed on leave pending investigation into violations of company policy. No names, no explanation. Clean language for a messy truth. I went home early. When I opened the door, the house felt tight, like it had been waiting. Hannah was already there, sitting at the dining table with her coat still on. Her purse was on the floor beside her, untouched. Her eyes were red, but her posture was rigid, like she'd practiced holding herself upright. "You blindsided me," she said. I set my keys down carefully. "I stopped covering for you." Her jaw tightened. "You could have talked to me." "I've been talking to you for months," I said, voice calm. "You just didn't need to hear it." She stood up abruptly. "You planned this." "Yes," I replied. The word landed between us like a stamped document. Not cruel, just final. She searched my face, maybe for anger, maybe for satisfaction. She didn't find either. "This wasn't about humiliating you," I said. "It was about keeping reality intact." Her eyes filled again. "I felt invisible," she said, almost pleading, like that sentence could excuse everything that came after. I let the silence stretch before I answered. "I believe you," I said. "But feeling invisible doesn't justify erasing me." Hannah's shoulders dropped a fraction. She sat back down, hands pressed together on the table. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. I went to my bag and pulled out a thin envelope. I placed it on the table in front of her. "What's that?" she asked. "Clarity," I said. Inside were copies of the financial statements I had saved, a list of accounts I had already secured, and a preliminary separation outline prepared by an attorney I trusted. Not dramatic, not vindictive, just structured. Hannah stared at the papers like they were written in a language she hadn't learned. "You talked to a lawyer," she whispered. "I talked to facts," I replied. "The lawyer helped me put them in order." Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked at the statements, at the dates, at the amounts. The way I'd highlighted patterns, the way I'd noted times. "You were watching," she said. "Yes," I answered. Quietly. She covered her face with her hands. "I never meant to hurt you." I waited until her breathing steadied enough that I could speak without turning it into a debate. "I know," I said. "But intent isn't the same as restraint. You taught me that." Hannah sat very still for a long time. Then she slid the envelope back toward herself, not rejecting it, not accepting it, just acknowledging it existed. Her voice came out small. "Where do I sleep tonight?" "In the guest room," I said. "Not as punishment, as a boundary." She nodded once, stood, and carried her purse upstairs. I stayed at the table, looking at the chair she'd been sitting in, listening to her footsteps move away. Then I took out my phone, opened my notes, and wrote one more line under the checklist I'd been keeping all week. Step completed. Home is now separate. And for the first time since the party, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. The next few days moved forward with the kind of efficiency my company was built on. Once something becomes a compliance matter, it stops being personal. It becomes a process. Questions are scheduled, documents are requested, timelines are compared. People who used to chat in hallways start speaking in careful sentences. On Monday morning, legal asked me to come in at 9 p.m. I walked into a small conference room on the 5th floor, the kind we used for private client calls. A glass pitcher of water sat on the table beside 2 empty cups. Someone had placed a notepad in front of each chair, as if we were going to brainstorm. The only difference was the quiet seriousness in the room. Legal had 3 people present. Compliance had 1. HR sat near the door. No one raised their voice. No one looked excited. They asked the same kinds of questions they ask when a vendor invoice looks wrong, except this time the numbers were tied to people. "Can you confirm the ownership of the original files?" Legal asked. "Yes," I said. "I authored them. I can provide creation dates and version history." "Can you confirm when you first noticed unauthorized access?" "I pulled the logs as part of a routine audit," I replied. "The access occurred on 2 dates outside normal business hours. Both were tied to Hannah's credentials." "Did you grant Hannah permission to access your archived folder?" "No." "Did you grant Derek permission to use your work in the deck presented last week?" "No." I stayed calm because calm was the most accurate way to speak. If I added emotion, it would change the shape of the facts. I didn't want the facts to bend. They asked about the financial movement next. I slid a folder across the table and let it speak first. Statements, transaction IDs, dates, amounts, notes I had written in plain language. No accusations, just patterns that could be verified. Compliance looked at one line, then another. "These transfers are structured," she said quietly, more to the room than to me. "Yes," I replied. "Small enough to blend, frequent enough to add up." Legal asked if I could confirm the account holders and access permissions. "I can," I said. "It's a joint account. Both of us have access, which is why the pattern matters. If it was a mistake, it would be random. This is controlled." They didn't argue. They didn't comfort me. They did what they were supposed to do. They collected, verified, and moved on. At the end of the meeting, legal said, "Thank you for keeping your documentation clean." It was an odd sentence to hear in the context of a marriage cracking open, but I understood what it meant. Clean records remove room for stories. That afternoon I got a short email confirming the project was being reassigned under formal review. My name was included on the new working group, not as a reward but as a practical decision. The work had to be rebuilt with clear ownership, and the company needed someone who could defend each step. I didn't feel proud about that. I felt tired in a quieter way. At home, Hannah and I spoke only about logistics, not emotions, not the past, not explanations that would turn into a loop. She stayed in the guest room. She moved carefully through the kitchen as if she was a guest in her own life. The first night, she tried to talk. I could hear it in her breathing and the way she paused at the doorway. "Ethan," she said. I looked up from the counter where I was sorting mail. "What?" Her eyes were swollen, but her voice was controlled, like she was still trying to manage the narrative. "I never planned for it to become this," she said. I waited. She swallowed. "I thought it was temporary. I thought we would figure it out after the pitch." I nodded once. "That is what you told yourself." She flinched slightly at the calmness of my tone, like she expected anger because anger would have given her a role to play. "I'm sorry," she said, quieter now. I believed she meant it in that moment. I also knew what it didn't change. I let her apology sit between us without trying to fix it. "I appreciate you saying it," I said, "but I'm not going to pretend we can go back to normal." Hannah's eyes stayed on the floor. "So that's it." "That's the boundary," I replied. "We can be civil, we can be practical, but we're not sharing a life the way we were." She nodded slowly, like she was hearing the words for the first time, even though the paperwork on the table had already said them. That week became a series of small, controlled actions. I revoked shared access to my personal cloud storage. I changed passwords. I turned on two-factor authentication everywhere it mattered. I separated the direct deposits. I redirected my paycheck to an individual account I'd opened quietly the day after the party, with just enough money moved over to cover bills I was responsible for. Nothing dramatic, just clean lines. At work, legal and compliance kept moving. They asked for copies of everything. I provided it. They asked for a timeline. I gave them one that didn't include feelings, only dates, times, and file names. When they asked how I knew what to look for, I didn't talk about betrayal. I talked about controls. "Unauthorized access is easier to prove than intent," I said. "Intent becomes clear when the access repeats." Compliance asked about the retirement adjustments next. I handed over the statements. They looked at the transfer pattern and the linked entity details. "Do you recognize this LLC name?" she asked. "No," I replied, "and I didn't authorize it." She wrote something down without changing her expression. That was the part that felt almost surreal. My marriage was being reduced to a checklist, but it was also the first time I felt like no one could twist it into a story. Facts moved faster than explanations ever could. By Thursday, the rumor cycle started doing what it always does in an office. People asked questions without asking them. They offered support without details. My manager stopped by my desk and said quietly, "If you need anything, tell me." I thanked him and went back to work. I didn't want to be comforted. I wanted the process to finish clean. At home, Hannah and I ran on logistics. She stayed in the guest room. She packed a little at a time, not like someone leaving in anger, more like someone trying not to make noise. She moved through the kitchen carefully. She didn't touch my things. I didn't touch hers. One evening, she stood in the doorway while I was sorting mail and said, "I don't know how to make this right." I looked up and chose my words the same way I chose them in a difficult meeting. "You can't make it right," I said. "You can stop making it worse." She flinched, then nodded. The next morning, I received a message from HR. Short, formal, a request to confirm one last detail about the timeline. I replied with one sentence and attached the log. Then I closed my laptop and sat still for a minute. It struck me that this was what clarity felt like. Not relief, not victory, just the absence of confusion. Sophie and I kept our distance on purpose. We didn't meet in the hallway. We didn't talk in open areas. When we did communicate, it was brief and specific. On Saturday, she texted me one line. "Legal says the evidence stands. No room to argue." I read it once and didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't care, because I didn't want to turn it into a celebration. I typed back later. Understood. That same afternoon, Hannah asked if she could come into the kitchen to pack some dishes that had been hers before we married. The request was small, but it told me she was already thinking in separate lanes. Go ahead, I said. Take what you need. She worked quietly, wrapping plates in paper towels, placing them in a box. Her hands shook once. She stopped, breathed, then kept going. After a while, she said, I told myself you wouldn't notice. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. I noticed a lot, I replied. I just kept choosing the calmer explanation. She nodded like she deserved that. On Monday, she came home early with a suitcase in her hand. I'm going to stay with my sister for a while, she said. Okay, I replied. No argument. No pleading. No scene. She stood near the door and looked around the living room, the half-finished tree, the stack of unopened holiday cards, the quiet order of a house that had once been shared without thinking. I didn't want to hurt you, she said. I know, I answered. But you still made decisions that did. Her eyes filled again, but she didn't fight. She didn't try to rewrite. She just nodded once, turned, and walked out. The door closed with a soft click. I stood there for a few seconds, listening to the furnace, the settling of the house, the ordinary sounds that had survived everything. 2 days later, I changed the locks. Not because I was afraid she'd come back and take something, because the boundary had to exist in the real world, not only on paper. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a folder of documents stacked neatly beside it. I checked off the final items on my list, one at a time, the way I always did when I needed life to feel manageable. When I finished, I turned off the light, went upstairs, and lay down in the bed alone. For the first time in weeks, I slept without waking up to question what I had missed. The house learned how to be quiet again, not the brittle quiet that comes after an argument, and not the hollow quiet of waiting for someone to come home. This was different. It settled slowly, room by room, like the place was adjusting to new rules. I kept the tree lights on for another week. Not out of hope, just because I liked the soft glow in the evenings. Then one night I unplugged them, wrapped the cords neatly, and put the boxes back where they belonged. I started doing small things on purpose. I cooked meals that took time. Nothing fancy, just steady. Soup, rice, roasted vegetables. Food that made the kitchen smell like something lived in again. I cleaned as I went. I wiped the counters. I stacked the plates. I didn't leave mess behind for a future version of myself to deal with. At work, the investigation finished the way most corporate investigations finish, quietly and completely. Derek's calendar blocks disappeared. His badge stopped working. The company sent an internal follow-up with more careful language. Hannah's name wasn't discussed in the open, but the outcome became obvious in the way people stopped asking about her. The initiative they tried to claim was rebuilt under a different team with a paper trail so clear no one could pretend it belonged to anyone else. Leadership thanked me. Legal thanked me. Not with big speeches, just with the kind of brief professional acknowledgement that meant they understood what I had prevented. I didn't feel proud. I felt clean. Hannah and I finalized the separation in the same tone we had used for logistics. Papers, dates, signatures, a few meetings with attorneys, a few practical conversations about what stayed and what went. She apologized once more, quietly, without defending herself. I accepted the apology without promising anything beyond civility. I wanted to forgive you, I told her at one point. But forgiveness doesn't mean we keep living together. She nodded like she finally understood the difference. When it was done, I didn't celebrate. I just went home and reorganized a drawer that had bothered me for years. Batteries, old keys, random cords. I labeled a small container for each category. It was ordinary. It was soothing. It reminded me that order wasn't a personality trait. It was a choice. Sophie and I stayed in touch, but in a measured way. We met for coffee once a month at the same quiet cafe. We didn't talk about Derek unless it was necessary. We talked about sleep, about therapy, about how strange it felt to be tired without carrying a secret. Sometimes we sat in silence and it didn't feel awkward. It felt respectful. One Saturday she asked, "Do you ever think about confronting them sooner?" I thought about it for a moment. I could still picture the ballroom, the dim space behind the bar, the way my hands went numb. "Sometimes," I said, but then I remember that waiting wasn't weakness. It was preparation. Sophie gave a small nod. "People confuse quiet with giving up." "I used to," I said. "Now I don't." A few weeks later, I started running again in the mornings, not to punish myself, not to prove anything, just to move. The sidewalks were slick in places, and the air still had winter in it, but I liked the rhythm. Shoes on pavement, breath in the cold, the simple certainty that I could start and stop when I chose. One evening, I was washing a glass at the sink, and it slipped slightly in my hand. I caught it before it hit the counter. The small sound it made when I set it down again was solid, normal, no sharp edge to it. I stood there for a second, listening, and realized I hadn't felt that tight, frozen feeling in my chest for a while. That was the real change. Not that everything was easy, not that I didn't have quiet days, but nothing was hidden anymore. I wasn't negotiating with denial. I wasn't asking for the truth from someone who had already decided to avoid it. A month after the separation was finalized, I got an email from someone in another department, a man I barely knew. We had spoken twice in meetings, both times about timelines and deliverables. His message was short. He said he had seen what happened with Derek and Hannah. He said he didn't want details. He just asked one question. "How did you stay calm long enough to handle it clean?" I stared at that line for a while, then typed a simple reply. I told him what I had learned. Don't argue with stories. Collect facts. Protect your access. Put everything in order before you speak. I didn't send him a speech. I didn't try to be a hero. I just sent the steps, because sometimes that's what people need. Not comfort, not heat, just something steady to hold on to. That night, I put my phone face down, turned off the kitchen light, and walked through the quiet house one room at a time. Locks checked, stove off, windows latched, everything in place. Then I sat down with a cup of tea and let the silence be what it was. Not loneliness, space. If you stayed with me through this, thanks for listening. If you have ever had a moment where you realized something was wrong and you chose calm instead of chaos, I would like to hear how you handled it. Tap like and subscribe if you want more stories like this. And in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from and what time it is right now. 2 popular stories will appear next, and I think you'll recognize the same quiet pattern in both.